Kamala!
Hello? Hi!
Hey there!
Oh, hi, you're both together. Oh, it's good to hear you both.
I can't have this phone call without saying to my girl Kamala, I am proud of you. This is going to be historic.
We called to say Michelle and I couldn't be prouder to endorse you and to do everything we can to get you through this election and into the Oval Office.
Oh, my goodness. Michelle, Barack, this means so much to me. I am looking forward to doing this with the two of you, Doug and I both, and getting out there, being on the road. But most of all, I just want to tell you the words you have spoken and the friendship that you have given over all these years mean more than I can express. So thank you both. It means so much. And we're going to have some fun with this too, aren't we?
Stand up. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Friday show. My guest is the brilliant, the always amazing Tim Wise, anti-racist speaker, writer, and man, is he very good today, as you can imagine. And for everybody who was at our Hangout last night, thank you very much. It was fun, as always, and I'm very excited that I'll be sharing that with you pretty much every week. You can get the link to it if you're a paid subscriber. You'll see that in today's email, and you can relive or enjoy for the first time last night's Hangout. We had a really good time. We had a candidate there, Stephanie Jo Yoakum of Indiana, who is running for state Congress, and it was awesome. Send me candidates to interview on the show and to have at the Hangouts. I really appreciate it. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, it's the Friday show. I've got to get right to my conversation with Tim Wise. You're going to really like this. Thank you so much for your support. No, I can't have these conversations without it. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic right now. Tim Wise will be part of this really a very cool project from the African American Policy Forum that's starting in just 3 days, the 5th annual Critical Race Theory Summer School. If you want to be a part of it, you can sign up at the link in the show notes or just go to AA Policy Forum, aapf.org. All right, let's do it right now with Tim Wise. Tim Wise, welcome back. I've so been wanting to talk to you.
Good to be back.
So when Joe Biden announced that he would step down and then supported Kamala Harris, and you saw all these Democrats falling in line, what did you think then, and what do you think now about the consolidation around her, the support of her from Democrats?
My initial thought was that it was probably the first smart thing that the Democratic Party had managed to do collectively in a while, because I really had this fear that they were going to draw it out, that they were going to make the convention a spectacle, and in the process really disrespect the obvious person who at this point should be the nominee, and that's Kamala Harris. So the fact that they didn't do that, the fact that they didn't leapfrog her, the fact that they immediately began to rally around her, and now former President Obama's come out and endorsed her as well. The fact that you've got 100 and something thousand white women doing a Zoom call last night, all getting behind Kamala Harris, realizing that the majority of white women 2 elections in a row voted for Donald Trump. What that tells me is folks are not necessarily holding out for their quote unquote perfect choice, because everybody's got one of those. And there's thousands of people that have opinions on that. Whether you think Kamala Harris is perfect, nobody's perfect. Joe Biden wasn't perfect. No candidate is perfect. But in this particular moment, she is the perfect person for this time and for this period. And she is the one, far more than any other Democrat that could have been picked, who is best able to get under the skin of Donald Trump. And getting under the skin of Donald Trump and making him say all the unforced errors that will remind America of how incredibly unstable and hateful and petty this man is. That's what we need. And I'm sorry, no other candidate can do that. There's no white guy that can get under his skin like a black woman beating him and showing him up day after day. So in that regard, it is symbolically really the perfect choice, and I'm glad they made it.
You didn't mention Michelle Obama. I guess a lot of people, Michelle and Barack, on a phone call to Kamala, you said she got Barack Obama, President Obama's endorsement today, but I guess that's going to crush a lot of people who had predicted that Michelle Obama would be the nominee. So many people did now. There are receipts for that. Do we cash them in now, or are those people going to continue to have audiences and credibility?
Well, I mean, one of those receipts is Vivek Ramaswamy. Like, whatever. Like, who cares what he says? This is a guy who we will literally not hear from in 5 years. Nobody will know who he is. He'll take his Silicon Valley money, and I'm sure he'll make a ton of dough, but nobody's going to listen to this kid. He's basically a no one who has said repeatedly things that prove to be wrong. Right. They keep putting a microphone in his face. So whatever. No, who cares? It's the same people that said Michelle Obama was a man, right? Like, who cares? They all say ridiculous things and we should ignore them.
I feel like a lot of people were rightfully concerned that a woman could not get elected in the United States of America and that a black woman would have an even harder time. And I think that was fair. I think that's a fair concern, even though obviously Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, but she didn't win the Electoral College, so she doesn't win the election. Those states obviously matter. You mentioned white women being a lot of the reason for that. We can talk about other reasons. But I think it was a fair concern, is still a fair concern that a woman can't win, a black woman can't win. But it would seem, based on some of what you just touched on, and more of what we've seen, that our opinions are changing to be more favorable because of the reaction and some of the unorthodox things we've seen, these phone calls that have raised millions of dollars in minutes. Do you think we're changing our opinion on can a black woman, can this woman actually win?
I would think so. And I'm actually going to offer a slightly different take on it. Obviously, look, no one, and I'm the last person who's going to downplay the seriousness of white racism, white supremacy, or misogyny. But the reality is that, and we learned this with Barack Obama, there is a degree to which when you are forced to make a decision as a white person that could, depending on how you make it, expose you as a racist, right? There is this little voice in the back of our head at this point of our evolution as a country that says to the reason, not to the right-wing MAGA person, they're going to do what they're going to do, but to that person who's actually swingable, who's reachable, who could be a Democratic voter, that person wants so badly not to be racist, right? There's that little angel of their better nature that's on the shoulder. Don't do this. And in a way, having someone who is a person of color and a woman of color in particular at the top of the ticket, I think it makes it harder. You don't have the plausible deniability, right? That the reason you voted against a Democrat was for racial reasons. Whereas if that candidate's white, but let's say you still identify the Democratic Party with those people, you identify the Democratic Party with black folks, with brown folks, but the head of the ticket is white, you can vote against that white person and never have to think to yourself, even subconsciously, oh, I wonder if I did it because I'm prejudiced against this group or that group. But if the person is in fact black and a woman, you have a woman of color at the top of the ticket, how are you going to deny if you're normally open to voting for a Democrat? If you're MAGA, no, you're going to vote against a Democrat for ideological reasons that may or may not be related to race or gender. They might not. But if you're one of those people that we're fighting over and you normally would look at the Democrat, but you're like, oh no, I think I'm out. How are you going to reconcile?
I'll tell you how, because Kamala Harris was soft on crime, my friend. District Attorney of San Francisco, Attorney General of the largest state, population-wise. She let criminals go, and Joe Biden didn't do that, will be the thing that people will say, even though they had probably, I don't know about their punitive.
Well, I mean, it's like we got to get our narrative straight, right? Because for years we were told Kamala locked everybody up. That's what we were told. We were told she locked everybody up for weed. Turns out not true, right? She actually didn't do that. She had all kinds of policies that were actually effective, that were diversion program policies, that were policies to try to keep people from being incarcerated. And it did not, as a result of those things, lead to some massive spike in crime. In fact, during the years she was the AG, during the years she was DA, crime was consistently falling in California, as it was across the country, and has been really since the earliest part of the 1990s. So crime peaked in this country in 1992, 1993. And has been dropping consistently since that time. So the idea that she's somehow responsible for that isn't going to play. But my point here being, getting back to the race piece, yeah, there are going to be people who are never going to vote for a woman, period, a person of color, period, and let alone a woman of color. But those people were probably overwhelmingly going to vote against any Democrat. They were probably already so deeply in the MAGA fold that it wouldn't have mattered who the Democrats ran. They could have run a white guy, but those are the people that would have been, it's still all about helping them over us. That's what they did with Joe Biden. They looked at Joe Biden as some avatar of racial radicalism. They looked at Bill Clinton the same way. They looked at Hillary Clinton the same way. So by putting a woman of color at the top of the ticket, you're not activating that any more than it was already activated. But what you are doing is saying to those who were reachable, what you going to do now? And if they vote against her, even though their politics line up better with a Democrat, it's going to be very hard for most people in that camp to rationalize their decision without acknowledging their own biases. And I think as a result of that, a lot of people will line up behind her. Just like they did. You think all those white folks that voted for Obama weren't racist? Like that they didn't have a racist bone in their body? No, of course some of them did. But they also wanted to feel better about themselves. So they voted for the black guy. I'm all for that. If white folks want to feel better about themselves by voting for Kamala Harris and making sure Donald Trump's not president, I'm good with that. If whatever you got to tell yourself to vote against Donald Trump.
I don't like her. Let's get to some sexism and misogyny. I don't like her cackle. I don't like her laugh.
I like the fact that she can laugh. Donald Trump has never laughed. Donald Trump only laughs at his own jokes when he makes fun of people with disabilities. That's the only time I've ever seen the man smile.
It really is.
And literally, if we're going to compare laughs, could we compare, I don't know, the Don Jr.'s Coke-fueled laugh in the interview he just did with J.D. Vance from Mar-a-Lago, where he was speaking about 700 words a minute because, as we understand, cocaine is a powerful drug, or Adderall, or whatever the hell he's on. Let's compare the cackle, please. Let's compare the laughter. And then if people want to make fun of Kamala Harris's dancing, I know I've seen there's some clips of her moving and oh my God, look at that. That's horrible. But we've all seen Donald Trump with his two-hand tugger dance that he does.
That's right. The ski pole.
Stage, right?
Ski polling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So exactly. So what is, if that's what they've got, if what they have that they think is going to defeat Kamala Harris is talking about her laugh, I hope they continue.
They've got something more powerful than that, I think, which is that she's a cat lady. She does not have kids. To me, that feels like, I guess I can't make too many more jokes about it, only because it's so hurtful to women who, by a lot, can't have kids for any reason, and much less people who don't want kids, which is completely justifiable and welcome if you're asking me. But it does feel like a dumb thing to say, because they're very conservative, evangelical women. Maybe they just think it's God's plan whether or not they can have kids, but it seems like a very dumb thing to say, to put down women who don't have kids, and that's J.D. Vance is on record. How do you think that plays?
Yes, specifically it's aimed at women who don't have kids, but keep in mind he's also said that anyone who doesn't have kids maybe should have a higher tax rate. That just came out today, and really should have less role in deciding government, because we should give children votes but let their parents cast them for them, which would disempower single people. But this is a funny thing to say when you're a member of a party, a significant number of whose members are evangelical Christians who think Jesus was apparently good enough to redeem the world but not vote for president or have any role in the making of public policy. Like, how do you square that? And all the guys that followed Jesus, I don't think they were quiverful families like the Duggars. They were a bunch of guys following Jesus, all of them single, all of them childless, and apparently in J.D. Vance's mind, not good Americans, which they weren't. But this is the kind of thing that this party believes in. They really don't mind the single guy. In fact, they glorify the single guy because he can go out and score with as many women as he wants, and that's what they're all about. They're about men doing whatever it is they want to do. But if a woman doesn't have a child, then she is not fulfilling her purpose. That is the intrinsic misogyny of this party and of this movement. They view women as breeders and very little else. And so if a woman makes the decision that she doesn't want to have a child, or maybe just wants to have one child, right? Oh my God, how selfish is that? And what's so offensive about it, it's not just the misogyny, it's not just the creepiness of it, which I think it's weird, right? It's just weird to say that in the 21st century. Yeah. But what is also disturbing is it really reveals what's wrong with the right-wing worldview, because their whole worldview is we can only care about our own little tribe, whether that's our race, whether that's our nation, or by God, our little family over here in this suburb where we live or out in this rural community. We don't care about you. We can't care about you. So the idea that a single person or a husband and wife, or two men that are married or two women that are married and don't have kids couldn't care about America. That's the premise, right? You don't really care about America. You don't have skin in the game. You don't have a stake in the country. What? Like that? What you're saying is that people without kids can't care about other people's kids, can't care about the well-being of the country, can't care. Before I had children, I was 33 when I became a father. Do you think when I was 27, I was like, screw this country. I don't care what happens to it. I'm not even going to vote. No, I was politically active and cared about the country long before I had children. The idea that you can't care about the country unless you have kids is the kind of thing you could only believe if you view children as promissory notes to your country. It's like some transactional thing where your kid is an IOU. Your kid is not an IOU. Your kid is a unique human being who has their own views and their own beliefs and ought to have the right to voice them. And the idea that you're going to dismiss the views of millions of people who either can't have kids, don't want to have kids, or haven't had kids yet is to suggest that you just don't believe in the collective. You believe in this very
Right.
narrow, hyper-individualistic notion of care and concern, which doesn't go any further than your front door, which is a pathetic way to live as a human being. But that's what these people are all about and have always been about.
So well said, and such an important point. So many important points to the question about the childless, the poor, pathetic childless. The other thing now that we're talking about, comments that J.D. Vance has made, he said that Kamala Harris is not grateful as an American. And you hear this about liberals from conservatives a lot, that we hate America, we're not grateful. But you certainly hear a lot of to hear or see a white person say that about a black person is specifically in this case. You had this great tear on Twitter, and I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. What do you hear and when he says, when J.D. Vance or other politicians or white folks in general say, those black folks, they're not grateful to be in this great country?
Before I get to Kamala Harris's gratitude or lack thereof, let's say the only one really lacking gratitude when it comes to J.D. Vance is that sofa. I don't think there's any question the sofa lacks all gratitude.
Yeah, I think that's a fair
great.
I think it's a fair point. I think it's a Davenport. We found out recently it was actually a
it was not grateful as J.D. Vance was searching for change in a very strange way that one normally doesn't look for change in a sofa.
And that we have news sources saying the upholstery on that piece of furniture is actually abrasive. So it's like a tweed.
I think that's true. In his defense, he was just researching the Ottoman Empire, I'm sure.
Oh, wow. That's...
Anyway, enough with the jokes. Enough. But back to Kamala Harris. This idea of the lack of black gratitude, you hear this all the time. This isn't a new trope, right? This is something I remember it being hauled out when Colin Kaepernick was leading the charge to take a knee during football games. Why isn't he grateful for all America's given him? First of all, nobody gave him anything. Like, he went to a Super Bowl. He earned his position on that team. He is and was a really good quarterback. So the idea that it was like a handout to him is something you would only say to a black person. You wouldn't say that to, and like if there was a white athlete who had led that charge, no one would have said that. No one would have even thought to say that. We only said that with black folks because deep down there are a lot of white Americans who believe that anything black people have in this country was given to them as a gift for which they ought to thank us, rather than realizing that anything black folks have achieved in this country, they got through their own hard work and effort, whether that was getting free from enslavement. We forget that there were hundreds of slave rebellions. There was an abolitionist movement led by black folks, not just by well-intended white people. There were 120,000 black soldiers who served in the Union Army, which were critical to the outcome of that war. So black folks led the fight for their own freedom. Black folks led the fight to get rid of Jim Crow laws and segregation and to have access to schools and access to jobs and access to good housing. So it wasn't given. None of that was a handout. The only people in this country who have actually been given anything for which we are never sufficiently grateful is, in fact, white folks. It was white folks who were given 240 million acres of essentially free land under the Homestead Act, most of it west of the Mississippi, so they could go and farm or ranch or whatever. Black folks couldn't get that. Brown folks couldn't get that. And indigenous folks were the ones whose land was in most cases being taken. Right. That was a handout, right? It was the FHA loans from the 1930s to the 1960s, the first 30 years of the FHA program, where 98% of those loans, government-backed, government-guaranteed, low-interest loans, were given to white families because black and brown folks were essentially excluded. That is about 35 to 40 million white Americans in 15 to 20 million white families, about 40% of all suburban housing for white folks in the middle of the 20th century that was given as a result of, or loaned preferentially as a result of, a government policy. Donald Trump, for God's sake, is an avatar for unearned handouts. Here's a guy who got $400 million.
Yeah.
In cash and prizes and a real estate portfolio from his dad. Didn't have to work for any of that. His own children have benefited from that, right? So this idea of who needs to be grateful. First of all, black folks have fought and died for everything they've attained. It's white folks who have consistently been given, and we were the ones who were given citizenship first. We were the ones who were told in the Naturalization Act of 1790 that only we could even be citizens. What is that? What is the Homestead Act? What are those FHA loans? What is the racially restrictive GI Bill for the first 20 years? What is the fact that the Social Security Act created this great retirement program, but essentially black folks were excluded for the first 20 years because it carved out exceptions for agricultural workers and for domestic workers, people who worked in other folks' homes, which is where 85% of all black folks worked, either in agriculture or as domestic workers. So for 20 years, white folks had access to that. Black and brown folks didn't. Where's the gratitude? Where's the gratitude for all of those white affirmative action pieces that we never talk about? And the answer is there is none, because we're too busy telling black folks to be grateful because we view them fundamentally as inferior. And that's what J.D. Vance was saying when he said that. You people should be grateful for all that we've done for you, when in fact we haven't done anything for black folks that they haven't been doing for themselves.
What do you make of the reaction amongst black folks to Kamala Harris and the unbelievable support we've seen in the way that it's come, starting with these Zoom phone calls, and now white folks are copying, and it's great. I think it's all great. Oh, by the way, more specifically, I know someone questioned and you answered on Twitter that it seems a little bit weird that everybody's siloing off into these different categories to raise money, and I don't think it's weird at all. I think it's great, and I'm looking forward to the white, bald call that I'll be hosting. But what do you make of first of all, the energy from black folks across the country for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think it's really indicative of the fact that black folks are not just the base of the Democratic Party's sort of energy, and they have been for a very long time, but they're also the most keyed in and most aware of the practicality of American politics. One of the things that white progressives sometimes don't understand is, like, why do black folks not want Biden to drop out, for instance, for a long time? You looked at the polls, like it was a lot of white progressives that were pushing for him to drop out. A lot of black folks were like, hey, hold the line here. Let's not jump to conclusion. And that was because as they were looking at it at the time, they really had a calculus that said, look, y'all, this is going to be chaos if this happens. And they didn't think that the party would rally around Kamala Harris. They were afraid of that, right? But once the party has done that, now I think black folks are looking at it like, oh, y'all are for real. You're serious. Like, you're actually willing to have this woman be the nominee. In that case, then we're gonna throw down for her, because we can actually believe that maybe you're gonna respect us. You're gonna actually not try to leapfrog the woman of color the way that we expected you to. So black folks are very keyed into what the party's doing. They're very keyed into the political realities of America. And I think this is a representation of that. That's one of the reasons that a lot of black folks who, back in the day, in 2016 and 2020, I know a lot of black folks, for instance, whose politics were closer to Bernie Sanders' politics in terms of their views, but they did not form a significant base of Bernie's support, not because they disagreed with him on a lot of policies. If you went down the list, they would have agreed on a lot of them, but because they simply didn't believe that white Americans were going to vote for this guy with this set of politics. They were trying to be practical. Black folks are nothing if not practical when it comes to politics. And I think that's the lesson that we can all take away. As for this idea of how weird it is to have white women on a call and black women on a call, that was Tyler Austin Harper, who's a columnist at The Atlantic, who tweeted that out. And I enjoy following his threads. He has some interesting things to say. I think he's a really smart guy, but I just think he's wrong in this case. It's not weird, because what that white woman call for Harris was about saying, listen, we as white women, they were saying, realize that the last couple of elections, and really more than that, we've been voting like those white guys voting MAGA, voting for Trump, in spite of the misogyny, in spite of all the promises to overturn Roe, in spite of all the just overt sexism of this man, Donald Trump. We did the same thing as the white guys did, and we have to be accountable for that. We got to call out our people. And that's not weird. There was a group, as I mentioned in my response to Tyler today, there was a group in California back in 1996 when Prop 209 was on the ballot to get rid of affirmative action, called White Guys for Affirmative Action. Why did they do that? Why didn't they just have a People for Affirmative Action? Because the whole point is to flip the assumption that people make, right? The assumption, you see a white guy, you think, oh, he's probably against affirmative action. And these guys were saying, no, you need to think a little harder. You need to recognize that we don't all think the same way. And those white women on that call last night were basically saying, we know that a lot of our people have failed the racial justice movement, and for that matter, the gender justice movement. And we're here to say we're done with that. It's no different than Jewish Voice for Peace being a group that critiques Zionism, but specifically from a Jewish perspective. They could just call themselves Voice for Peace, but why? Like Republicans against Trump. There's value in that, as opposed to just like people against Trump. No, there's power in saying, as Republicans, this identity doesn't have to be what you think it is. So why is it that we have no problem with that when it's about religious group, or when it's about party group, or when it's about something like that? But if it's race or gender, we're like, oh, this seems weird. Why does it seem weird? I think it's actually brilliant political strategy.
Yeah. Also, it occurs to me that if you were to look at your text threads and your in real life friends and networks, they'd probably be like you. They probably would line up like you anyway. A lot of black women have a lot of black women friends, black men, black friends, white guys, mostly white friends, and white guys look at So you're really just getting together with a lot of your friends anyway, because for whatever reason you're like-minded, and the way that we self-segregate for any number of reasons, and like-minded folks can convince other like-minded folks. I think it's always so important to have people like you, white guys, talking to white guys like me. And you've changed didn't flip my point of view, but you've certainly made me a lot smarter and able to think about these things and share these thoughts with other people. I pay it forward. It seems natural to me to be getting together with.
I think so too. And it's one of the things I've never understood when people criticize. And there's a lot of critique right now around DEI programs that have like affinity group structures in the workplace where the people of color get together and talk, and then the white folks get together and talk, or the women talk and the men talk, or the LGBTQ folks talk and the straight and cisgender folk have their own group. And people on the right, and even some people that aren't on the right, have a problem with that. They feel it's self-segregation. I understand the criticism. I understand it feels weird because we're all trying to be kumbaya and hang out together. But the reality is, like you just said, we spend a lot of time in our own silo anyway. The question is, could we just spend a little bit of that time actually doing something productive? In other words, if we're going to be with a bunch of guys anyway, why not talk about how we're going to act in solidarity against sexism and misogyny? Why not? We don't just have to talk about sports. We don't just have to talk about the weather. We don't just have to talk about whatever it is we talk about, right? We can talk about something like that. As white people, we already spend a lot of time around other white people. Why not spend some of that time in the workplace, for instance, trying to figure out like, hey, how can we be better allies and act in solidarity with folks of color? And the beauty of that is when we do that, when we do the intra-group stuff, it actually can help make the intergroup stuff better and more effective because we go off into our own little silo. We get our shit together, right? We figure out like, hey, how do we want to come at this? And we come at it with purpose. And then we get back together with folks of color, or if it's a sex and gender thing, we get back together with women, or we get back together with LGBTQ folks if we've divided on that basis. And now we can work together because we've processed some of our own stuff. They've processed their stuff. Now we can process our stuff. It's not weird. It just seems weird to people who have bought into this idea that the end all be all is the kumbaya. And the reality is the kumbaya isn't likely to happen as long as we have not processed some of the conditioning that we as white folks have been subjected to, that men have been subjected to, that straight folks have been subjected to, et cetera. We got to process that. And I got news for you. Marginalized people don't want to see white straight men process our shit. Like they don't want to watch us do that. They don't want to necessarily be in that room when we're like hashing it out.
Oh no, I've had those folks watch me process my shit. It's cringe for me.
It's really cringe.
Yeah, they're like
most folks of color don't want to be in that room until we get our shit together. Most women don't want to watch us process our toxic masculinity. They want us to process it. And they may not trust us to do it on their own, but that doesn't mean that they're knocking on the door. Can we observe? Probably not.
I was complaining, just this example you're saying, I just have to tell people and you. I was talking to my friend Christina Greer, Dr. Christina Greer, of course, a black woman, and we had stopped recording, and we were catching up personal, and I was whining about something, and she immediately started making fun of me. And it was very refreshing the way that she did it. And then she gave me really cogent, sage advice. It was thoughtful. But it was that example. And I'm not saying it's just because she's a black woman, but it immediately gave me perspective on what I was complaining about. And it was so funny. And so when done that way, it's wonderful. But that is an example of just what you're talking about. They don't want to see us, marginalized folks don't want to see us white men processing shit. What do you say to I've asked Chrissy Greer, I've asked Celeste Headley yesterday, and I ask you, and you've been talking about this, obviously, and writing about it for years. What do you make of, what is your response to those criticizing Kamala Harris for being a DEI hire who slept her way to the top?
First off, the slept her way to the top thing. First of all, aside from the fact it's not true, when you're the guy running against her who has
or supporting that guy,
or if you're supporting the guy who has a history of questionable sexual activity, let's just say in the middle of his own marriages, he has a history. We understand he paid off a sex worker and is now in trouble.
You're being too kind. You're being too kind. Maybe you don't endorse this, but J.L. Covan said, I'd be fine if she slept her way to the top because her opponent raped his way to the top. Said it right here on this podcast.
Right.
So
this is a guy, but that was where I was going next. This is a guy who literally, you got to build up to the rape part.
Sorry. My bad. I should have known.
This is literally a rapist, and he's on Epstein's list, for God's sake. And there's all kinds of reason to believe that he enjoys the young ones quite a bit more than he has let on. We know this is a guy who pervs on his own daughter, talks about how if it wasn't his daughter, he'd probably be dating her. So anything you want to throw at Kamala Harris about sexual stuff is not, I don't think that's going to play very well. And it's obviously absurd. The DEI piece is, again, revelatory for what it says about how right-wing people instinctively view women, and particularly women of color, or people of color generally, especially women of color, because they say it over everything. Look, we all know DEI is the new N-word to these people. That's what it is. So when we've talked about this before, when that barge hit the bridge in Baltimore, the mayor of Baltimore was a DEI mayor, because we all know that if he'd been white, he would have had some white guy superpower that would have reinforced the bridge so it wouldn't have fallen down. We have Boeing jets that are having the emergency doors blow out in the middle of the flight, and they blame it on a DEI program for black pilots, because we all know that black pilots are the ones who solder the door to the airplane before they take off. And so they're to blame. This is just a way of saying a racial slur without saying a racial slur. And in this particular instance, what's so bizarre about it is to claim that a vice president currently and now presidential candidate is a DEI, or let's say for when she was chosen by Joe Biden, that was a DEI pick. All vice presidential picks serve the same function. Doesn't matter which party, doesn't matter which year. It's always about picking someone who you feel can activate a key constituency within your voter base. So do we think Sarah Palin, for instance, was chosen because she was the second most qualified person to possibly be a president from the Republican Party? No, she was chosen because, rightly or wrongly, as it turned out, John McCain thought she would bring something to the ticket. When they chose Dan Quayle, and when George Bush I chose Dan Quayle, it wasn't because Dan Quayle was anybody's idea of the next best person in some objective 300 million people, let's evaluate the resume sense of the word. It was because the evangelical right wing didn't trust George Bush I, and Dan Quayle was a bona fide Christian conservative who voted the way that they liked, and so they picked him. And that's not to take away from Kamala Harris's real accomplishments. It's just to say it's no different here. When you pick a vice president, you're picking someone who you think can help you. When Michael Dukakis picked Lloyd Benson, it wasn't because he's like, that Lloyd Benson, what a number two. He wanted to have a shot in Texas, right? It didn't work, but that was the thinking. They're coming at this as if somehow the person for vice president, it's like some AI program. It's like AI resume reader looks at 330 million resumes and then spits out the number two most qualified person. That's not how politics work. What makes you qualified in a political sense is, can you deliver the votes? That's the only qualification. Right. Can you, in fact, deliver the votes? And you know what? When Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris, it delivered the votes. So by definition, and she's won other elections other than that, by definition, she is qualified using the only metric that matters in this particular realm. Now, do you want to hire her to run your company? I don't know. I don't know anything about her private sector abilities or experience. But in terms of politics, the one thing that actually makes you qualified is the thing that she has proved. Right. And so aside from it being racist, aside from it being sexist, aside from it being their new version of the N-word, it's also absurd because it fails to appreciate what all political choices for vice president are. J.D. Vance, for God's sake, was not chosen because anybody in that party actually believes that of all the people that Republicans could choose to come after Trump, that he's the next guy. Right. They chose him because they thought, and I think incorrectly, that he's going to activate the hillbillies, whatever, or Peter Thiel's money or whatever. Do you think, but that's not
given what we're seeing play out right now and his lack of performance and everything that's being dug up that he did, and even things that he didn't do. No evidence he had sex with the couch, but the memes are constant. At some point, he might have to address this, and that's the kind of hilarity. That's what happens when you get a candidate who young people really like. They make memes that make her look good, in this case, Kamala Harris, and those same young people make hilarious memes that make this jackass look terrible. He's looking terrible on his own, and people are already, if somebody even asked Trump, I think Fox and Friends, are you thinking about maybe replacing him, because everybody's talking about his failure to launch from the RNC to now for any number of reasons. What do you think about all that talk about how badly he's doing? Not to mention the fact that they're hanging Project 2025 right around his neck because he wrote the foreword for the book about it from the guy who created it, the author.
Well, J.D. Vance on your ticket is what happens when you yourself, meaning Donald Trump, don't really trust anybody anyway except your own gut, and then you turn to your Adderall or Coke-fueled son who's friends with J.D. Vance, and he tells you this is the guy, and you want the Peter Thiel money, and so you get him, but you don't even do any research because we know Donald Trump doesn't read. He's not going to look up any of the background or the history on this guy. And so now he's stuck with them, and he's going to have, all of a sudden, Donald Trump supports late-term abortion, but he's going to have to carry Vance to term. There's no way that he is going to let J.D. Vance, there's no way he's letting J.D. Vance go, because to let J.D. Vance go would be to acknowledge he had made a mistake. And one thing we know about Donald Trump is he never acknowledges that he makes a mistake. He says, I hired the best people, and by God, I know what I'm doing, and I'm competent. So he wants everybody to think that he vetted this, he thought about this at length. We know he didn't. But as a result of getting him now, it is too late. He could back off. He's not going to back off, because that would be completely unlike anything Donald Trump has ever done. So now he's stuck with this guy. And I think it's going to demonstrate once again the same thing we learned with Sarah Palin. You pick somebody because you think they're going to appeal to a particular demographic on your side, and it turns out they just don't pick very well. They thought Paul Ryan would do the same thing, right? For Mitt Romney, it's, that guy, that policy wonk. I'm sure people will love the policy wonk who reads Fountainhead before he falls off. I'm sure people are going to love that. The Ayn Rand cultist. Yeah, no, they just don't know what they're doing when it comes to that. And particularly when you've got a Donald Trump at the head of the ticket who won't listen to what his advisor. I'm sure there were advisors who were telling him, I don't know about this one. But Donald Trump doesn't listen to anyone whose last name isn't Trump. So if Don Jr. comes along and says, J.D. Vance and, Peter Thiel money, and maybe this is how I'll get Elon to support me and I'll get all these tech bros, then that's what he's going to do. And now he's stuck with it.
Finally, given what's transpired since last Sunday and the endorsements and the delegates, she's got it locked up. What is your personal feeling about how this is all transpired looking ahead? Because we've been talking a lot about this feeling that we thought we'd lost called hope. What are your thoughts?
I'm certainly more hopeful today than I was a week ago and 2 weeks ago. And so I think there's certainly reason to be excited. I also understand this system that we live in. We know that Donald Trump was likely to lose the popular vote regardless, and he will now, and I would imagine by quite a bit. The problem, of course, is that we live in a country where the Electoral College, a holdover from the days of enslavement, and that was one of the primary purposes for which it was created, was to give certain power to certain folks over other folks. As a result, we got about 5 states that matter. And the problem in those 5 states is that they do not necessarily, in each case, reflect the broader Democratic electorate around the country. And so you end up having to narrowly tailor your message to Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona and Nevada and Georgia. And the message you tailor is not going to be the same for one of those versus the other. So there's still this, it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. But do I think that Kamala Harris is in a far better position vis-a-vis Donald Trump than Joe Biden? Oh, that goes without saying. And depending on who she chooses as her running mate, this is one of those situations where that may actually matter. I don't think it'll matter a ton, but I think it'll matter at the margins. It doesn't have to be someone from a swing state. It just has to be someone who plays relatively well in one of those states. And I believe she's got several choices that would fit that bill. So I would say it's very much a toss-up right now. And I wouldn't have said that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. I was pretty much looking at property in Portugal.
Yeah.
Not really. I wasn't going to run, but I was nervous. And I'm still nervous, but I'm nervous. Now I'm nervous the way I was in 2020, which was manageable. Now I'm nervous in the way I was even in 2012 and 2008, which is manageable. I was nervous in a way different way a couple of weeks ago.
Do you want to, we'll know within days who she picks, but I'll take this last moment to get your finger on the scale. Anybody that you think would work based on how you said our fucked up system works in terms of those 5 or 6 states?
I think all the 6 or 7 that I've heard mentioned could work, but there are a lot of considerations. Like I've heard people throw around Roy Cooper from North Carolina. The problem is you pick him and they win, and then you got, or even if he's out campaigning, Mark Robinson gets to play governor in the meantime in North Carolina, the guy that said some folks need killing or whatever. So that guy ends up getting to cosplay, and maybe that helps him in his campaign, and he might end up winning, God forbid. So you don't want to do that. You take Josh Shapiro, and because of the way Pennsylvania's rules of succession go, it would create possibly the loss of a tiebreaker because that legislature is evenly divided, and you need that ability. And if he leaves, who's going to become governor? We don't know. You pick, was it Mark Kelly in Arizona, right? Again, possibly a strong candidate, but then that Senate seat would have to be defended in 2 years, and that's critical to maintaining. So I think of those choices, they're all potentially strong. Andy Beshear probably has.
That's my guy there. That's my guy.
Andy Beshear probably has fewer downsides than any of the ones that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
He's not going to help Kamala Harris win Kentucky. But I think here's a guy, he and his father both, they actually govern quite progressively, right? They have been responsible for keeping folks on healthcare rolls in the state of Kentucky. His dad famously was instrumental in that. And he has been as well in the wake of ACA, making sure that Kentuckians are covered. And that is some core progressive stuff. Yeah, he doesn't come across like an overtly progressive person, but if you look at the way he governs, he's actually amazing. And so I think that he would make a pretty good candidate. I think he certainly knows how to handle people like J.D. Vance by reminding everyone, first of all, that J.D. Vance has never been to J.D. Vance vacationed in Appalachia when he went to visit his mamaw or whatever. But he was raised in an upper middle class suburb, an hour outside of Cincinnati or whatever. He had all the advantages of life. He didn't grow up like his mamaw and his papaw and all that. I know his mom was an addict. I understand that, which is why it's shocking that he then went to work. He was flacking for Purdue Pharma, right? This is a guy who actually has a mom who was addicted, talks about it all the time, but then he's on the wrong side of the opioid problem.
Oh, I did not know that detail about J.D. Vance.
Here's a guy who, this is a guy who can't be trusted with some of the problems that Appalachians face. He spends his whole book, Hillbilly Elegy, attacking people from Appalachia and calling them lazy, and except for his mamaw, who's got wisdom. But everyone else apparently is shiftless and lazy. Essentially, J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, is just Charles Murray applied to white people. It's just the bell curve applied to white people. It's basically saying these people are shiftless, they're lazy, but me, I'm good. I got out and became a venture capitalist and went to Yale and all these things. And so I think Andy Beshear knows how to respond to that in ways that maybe others would not. We'll see. But all these choices are good. It would be incredibly gutsy to pick Gretchen Whitmer. I love Gretchen Whitmer, but I think probably she's not going to do that for reasons that I think we can all into it. And there are other people who I think would be fantastic, but I think in this particular instance probably won't be chosen.
God, I love talking to you. I'm so glad you're available today. I really appreciate it whenever you are, and I hope that we can do it again soon, my friend. Thank you on behalf of everybody for joining us. Really good, as always.
You bet.
All right, there he goes, Tim Wise. Go check him out at African American Policy Forum, where he's now working. The Critical Race Theory Summer School starts in just 3 days. Go check that out. Let him know that you heard him here on the show. And, of course, as always, if you haven't, write a rating and review on Spotify or iTunes. Follow me on the social medias. I hope that you're doing okay here on a Friday, if you listen to it on Friday or anytime on the weekend. And I will see you and talk to you tomorrow, because I'm scheduled to have Christian Finnegan joining me for a Saturday show. We had taped something, and then we had to dump it because the news changed, and we were speculating so much on Biden's future, and so I just recreated it, and I think you're going to love it. Well, I hope we have to do it. So if it doesn't happen, it's because we both die. You guys are the best. You bumblebees. Love you. Bye. See the forest for the burning trees. You got to stand up. And you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know us right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up, you got to stand up, you got to stare the devil straight in the eye. You got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination.
with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.